Everybody's too quiet up here. Good afternoon, and welcome to this, the 6th meeting of the Space Roundtable here in the Senate. We have a better crowd than usual, and I can't imagine why that is. Today we've come together to consider efforts to fly private citizens in space. Before I start, I want to take a moment to acknowledge our benefactors for their continued support here in the Senate. In particular, I want to thank all of our Senate chairs, with special thanks to sponsoring chair of this event, Senator George Allen, who has not been able to get off the floor today to drop by and say hello, but I understand he's still trying. And our thanks to the staff of the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions for lending us this gorgeous room for the afternoon, and to the Small Business Committee for hosting our luncheon earlier. And of course, these events would not be possible without the always generous support of the Foundation for the International Non-Governmental Development of Space and its Executive Director, Rick Tumlinson, who joins us today in his capacity as President of the Space Frontier Foundation. As always, thank you, Rick. And today, also, Robert Bigelow of Bigelow Aerospace kindly underwrote the cost of our luncheon. Many thanks to you as well, sir.
I did?
I understand the check cleared, yes. So now to the subject at hand. During the past week, a number of people that I've talked to have referred to this event as a, quote, space tourism event, unquote. Personally, I've always had trouble with the term space tourist, as it doesn't describe the current state of affairs and instead inevitably leads to visions of fat guys floating around in Hawaiian shirts and white belts. And in recent days, the term space tourist has in some quarters taken on a pejorative tone, especially as applied to our friend Mr. Tito. Still, I'd be willing to accept it if we can use a more descriptive term to describe our professional astronauts. To me, it all makes sense if we refer to them as business travelers, because that's the distinction that defines the difference today. Let's consider earthbound travel. Say my friend Miles and I are traveling to San Francisco tomorrow. Miles will go on CNN Business to cover an event like this one. On the other hand, I'm going out to play golf in Monterey for a week, from my mouth to God's ears. To get there, we're both going to have to follow a similar process. Pack a bag, get to the airport, check in, get on a plane, and so on. Sure, we might prepare for the trips differently. Miles might review some background material on the event he's going to cover and pack a more formal wardrobe, and I'll head to the pro shop to stock up on golf balls, since mine always seem to disappear to the nearest water hazard. But those differences don't have anything to do with the journey itself, but rather our purpose in going. And I submit that we can apply that model to space. For the foreseeable future, both business and pleasure travelers to space are going to need significant training. The pros might train longer, but much of that extra training might have more to do with their job on orbit than the trip getting there. So there are two major differences between the pleasure and professional space traveler. The first is the reason they're taking the trip and what they intend to accomplish. But as important a distinction lies in who's paying for the trip. Returning to our earthbound analogy, when Miles travels, CNN picks up the tab, but my golf outing is on me. And so it is with our friend Dennis Tito. Contrary to most reports, most of us know that the first space tourists were members of Congress. But Mr. Tito is the first to pay his own way. And in doing so, he's changed one essential paradigm of space travel. But he did so only after receiving some 900 hours of training in Russia, much of the same training his fellow travelers received for their trip that was financed by their government. It is likely that one of the next non-government employees to fly will in fact be a business traveler. Director James Cameron, who had hoped to be here with us today, hopes to be the first media professional to create a revenue-generating production while in orbit. Still, many look at these efforts as aberrations, as exceptions rather than the rule. And that's precisely why all these folks have come here today to put that notion to rest. We're going to hear from an American hero who has a plan to bring the cost of a flight like Mr. Tito's within the financial reach of all of us. We'll hear from a man who's using his experience and financial resources gained from a successful career in hotels to create a private space station as a travel destination. One of our leading television space journalists will tell us why one of the next non-professional astronauts to go should be a member of his profession. Several experts on the market for private human spaceflight will share with you some truly amazing figures about the potential this new business holds. And the manager of NASA's space station program will discuss what all this might mean for the future of the ISS and for our civil space program as a whole. So that's why we're here. Now I'd like to go around the table and introduce our panel. From my extreme left, we have Eric Anderson of Space Adventures, a company that has received 100 deposits of $6,000 for $100,000 suborbital flights on vehicles that are still on the drawing board. Next to Eric is supposed to be Alan Ladwig, who Lori Garvard warned me wouldn't show up. And therefore she'll be drafted in his, to take his place if he's not here for the discussion. Next to the empty chair, we have a last-minute pinch hitter at State Senator Gilmer Capps of Oklahoma, who graciously stepped in for Bob Triplett when Bob was hit by a family emergency. Oklahoma has been aggressively pursuing this industry for several years, and Senator Capps will be giving us the how and why of that effort. Next to Senator Capps is Mike Hawes, who serves as Deputy Associate Administrator for Space Station at NASA, and who has demonstrated incredible personal courage by consenting to join this pack of free market jackals today. To Mike's right, we have one of the aforementioned jackals, Rick Tumlinson.
Chief Jackal.
That's right, yeah. Jackal in charge. That would be good. To my left is a man who needs no introduction. As a member of the first crew to land on the moon and the second to leave human footprints on its surface, Buzz Aldrin is and always will be a part of what many feel was the most significant historic achievement of the 20th century. And to my right is my new hero, Dennis Tito. Look up You look up perseverance in the dictionary and it says, see Dennis Tito. This man overcame incredible resistance to accomplish a feat that a lot of us have been waiting a long time to see, and the Space Roundtable is proud to host his first visit to Capitol Hill since returning from the International Space Station. Next to Dennis is Miles O'Brien of CNN. Now, I happen to be a news junkie, and Miles will be happy to know that most of the day his network is on in my office, and any number of times during his reports of various space events, I've heard him tell his colleagues how much he'd like to fly. And as Mr. Tito's flight went on, his tone got more plaintive. So we thought we'd invite him here today to make his case for sending a journalist into space. Next to Miles is Bob Bigelow of Bigelow Aerospace, who will be talking about his company's plans to put a private space station in orbit. During his 30-year career, his companies have developed and operated many thousands of hotel rooms and apartments across the country, and now he intends to put that experience to work in this new venture. Next, we have Tom Rogers, Chief Scientist of the Space Transportation Association, and a man I consider to be the institutional memory of commercial space. Every time I have what I think is an original idea, I call Tom and I talk to him about it at great length, and his usual response is, we tried that in October 1974, didn't work. And last but never least is Pat Dash, Executive Director of the National Space Society. She has been a valued member of each of our roundtables to date, and it's a pleasure to welcome her here again. Now, I had a really funny intro for Pat, but she has a big event coming up, so I didn't want to pick on her today. Okay, that's enough from me. Now, I would like to turn to Mr. Tito, who will share his thoughts on his experience with us and answer some questions posed to him by those of you who filled out cards at registration and by our friend Miles O'Brien. But before you begin, sir, I have one question for you. Like millions of others around the world, I'm looking forward to the day that I can experience a trip like yours. And it occurs to me that having you sit here next to me, there is one thing I can ask you that might help that happen sooner rather than later. Just what would your terms be for agreeing to a loan of $20 million?
Depends on how you're going to pay it back.
Somebody told me you were going to say that. I thought that was...
Okay, well, thank you, Mark, for inviting me and such a nice introduction. Approximately 2 weeks ago, I landed on the deserts of Kazakhstan and completed a mission that represented a lifelong dream, and I'm sure most of you are aware of that. For me, the experience went well beyond even those wildest dreams. I was prepared for a trek to Everest where I'd be miserable all the way, and just to experience space, maybe being ill the entire time. I still was going to go ahead and do it just so I could realize my dream. And the big surprise was that aside from a small bout of space sickness in the first day, which didn't even ruin the day, the rest of the trip was, I would say, a major high, no pun intended. And for really the entire time that I was in space, it was just the most remarkable, thrilling experience I ever had in my life. And it wasn't even like life. It was like a different life. And I said to myself, you know, if other people really knew how this feels, we would have so many individuals lining up to fly that we would be able to develop several businesses, several space stations to satisfy that need. And you know, somehow this is a secret that has been very well kept by our astronauts who have flown. And I think because of their you know, being professionals, you know, they look at it as, well, day to day, this is what I do, no big deal. I know that astronauts do speak very highly of their flights, but I don't think any of them could have been as thrilled as I was being an unprofessional and not only experiencing space flight, but not having a work schedule like everyone else did. I didn't have mission control telling me what to do every minute. I decided what I was going to do. In fact, I volunteered to do some work during the night orbits. But most of the time I sat, or floated, I should say, listening to opera, looking out various portholes, photographing the Earth from different perspectives. And the week went by in a flash. It was over before it seemed like it started. And I could have actually stayed up there for months. I wasn't at all bored. So what I would like to bring back is this idea that there is nothing like this as an experience. And if I had not flown in space, knowing what I know now, and the price of the mission was X, and I had X plus $1, I would undertake this trip and then spend the rest of my life on welfare. It was really an unimaginable experience. So I'm open to questions.
All right, let's take a few questions which come from the audience. And I don't know if you said it specifically, what was the most unexpected observation or experience on your trip?
Well, I would say the entire trip, and that it was such a great pleasure from beginning to end. I was expecting the worst.
So no specific thing, the whole thing as an entity was?
Well, I had some connection with my children that I never had before by talking to them from space. It was, a few highlights like that, but it's hard for any one thing to stand out. It just was euphoria from beginning to end.
All those years your kids wanted to send you to the moon, and there you got close to them while you were in space. All right, what can the U.S. government do to encourage the development of a U.S.-based space tourism industry? And I'll just add to that, is that the role of the government, do you think?
Well, I think clearly the American people are excited about the idea. That's certainly the impression I get, and the impression I get from the media's interest in my flight. I think that we have to have ordinary citizens, not only wealthy individuals. And I think this can be done by bringing the Citizen Astronaut Program back into existence and reserve a seat on the shuttle for private citizens of different walks of life, and bring artists and journalists, poets, opera singers, rap singers, you name it, to space so that they can bring back the experience that I've had and relate to it in their own art form and make this part of our culture. There's more to space than science. This is a human experience, and I think it's an experience that all people on Earth should share with. And although we can't fly everyone up to space, we can bring space down to the people. And I think the government should begin with reinstituting the the Citizen in Space program.
Time for more? Okay. If NASA and Dan Golden were sitting here in the audience, what would you tell them? I don't see Dan Golden, but I do see some NASA faces. What's your message to NASA?
Well, I would say that if NASA hadn't, and Dan Golden hadn't worked as hard as they have worked in the last 8 or 9 years, putting together the space station, working with the Russians, I would not have had this opportunity. And my feeling is that NASA did a terrific job. And when you go up and see this station and see how large it is and how impressive it is, you realize what an accomplishment the ISS or Alpha is.
Time for more, or do we move
yeah,
on?
sure.
Let's do one more. As you went through the process, and it became, at times, perhaps a little more on the tense side between yourself and NASA, did you feel uncomfortable at any point? You, after all, have experience with Jet Propulsion Lab, involved in the Mariner missions years ago. Was that a source of discomfort for you to pursue your goal in spite of that?
Well, I was very determined, as you know, to fly. So I wasn't going to let anything stop me or bother me. I had to focus on my training. And, as long as, I knew that I was trained and whatever was said may not have been exactly correct, I just went ahead with my training. The main concern I had was, at certain points, was that the result may have been for the Russians to change their mind. And of course, if they changed their mind, I would have had to leave and not make my flight. And I was prepared for that. I knew all along that this flight could be stopped at any point, and there were no guarantees. But just like running a political campaign, you just go through the campaign, and whether you win or lose, you're still going to go through it. And that was the attitude I took.
And just to close it off at this point, Mark, do you think space travel on both the Soyuz and the shuttle, and I'm going to add the space station as well to this, and even in the context of the time you were there, is safe enough to accommodate space tourism? Because that was the issue.
Well, I think space travel has an inherent risk. I felt that there was about 99% chance that I would come back alive, which meant there was a 1% chance I wouldn't. And I envisioned that as a game of Russian roulette with a 100-barreled pistol. And I was willing to take that chance. And that's why I signed off on the liability. I went up in space knowing full well there was a possibility that I would not return. And I think as long as a citizen in space or going to space has that same expectation of what the risks are, it isn't like getting on an airplane, I think it's okay. If there were to be a tragedy, in my view, it's the lives that are lost that count. And it doesn't matter whether it's not any worse that a citizen dies versus an astronaut. We're all human beings, and a life is a life.
All right. Thank you, Dennis. And for one, I'm glad you came back, and thank you for coming here today. And to take us to the next step and beyond, I'd like to introduce my partner in putting these things together, Mr. Tumlinson. We have an excellent partnership. He pays for them, and I do the work.
And I try not to embarrass him too much when I speak. And again, I want to congratulate Dennis. There have been a lot of people running around saying, I put him in space, or I did this, or I did that. The truth is, the person who put Dennis in space was Dennis. The determination that he had to exhibit trying to get into that Soyuz was incredible. I witnessed it from the outside, sometimes the inside. And I have a feeling that when that hatch closed in the Soyuz, a lot of the hard work was actually over and the fun was about to begin, and he breathed a sigh of relief. Space was probably a benign environment compared to the one he had to go through to get there. I want to say thank you also to our hosts in the Senate and the folks that are here. You're going to hear some very interesting things. You've already heard a few. And I want to point out that I believe a change is coming in space. Mr. Tito's flight might be the marker in history where we look back and say, that's when the non-handoff of the frontier to the people themselves from the explorers who opened it actually began to happen. And I think with some fixes and some working together in the future, perhaps we can continue that move. One of the problems we've had to date is a lack of leadership. And without leadership and vision, NASA has been left to its own devices. And as any bureaucracy does, it has sort of squatted down and claimed some turf. That turf happens to be what I consider the near frontier between the Earth and the Moon. If you look at NASA's today's Lewis and Clark and Magellan's and Champlain's, until recently, they've done a very incredible job of exploring the frontier. But to put it bluntly, the wave that so shook our intrepid space explorers' canoes a few weeks ago was a tourist boat passing them by as they paddled in circles somewhere in the Missouri River. It's time to take a hint. It's time to understand that times they are a-changin', as Bob Dylan once said. It was not Mr. Tito who was necessarily in the wrong place in the space station. It was the astronauts. Because they should be on their way to Mars by now. They should be on their way to the far frontier and doing the exciting exploration that the pooled resources of the taxpayers can pay for and no business will. It was them who was in the wrong place, not Mr. Tito. And it's not their fault. It is the fault of those who make leadership decisions in this country that they haven't sent them in that direction. And so we find our astronauts actually having to be international diplomats, building managers, and caretakers to visitors to a visitor center they didn't know was one until people started knocking on the hatch. And that's an inappropriate role. Now, we can change that, and I think we need to change that, and I think we need to create a new partnership to change that. Personally, having been through some interesting battles involving MirrorCorp and other things over the last couple of years, I'm a little tired of fighting. And I'm a little tired of us all being confused over who should do what in space. We have to understand whose role is what. And I will refer to, since it's 2001, to the poster and the film of Arthur C. Clarke, to the film. In that movie, if you notice, it was a commercial vehicle that took the hero to a commercial hotel in low Earth orbit, who then flew to a mixed-use lunar base, and then to go out and investigate the obelisk in deep space, the heroes climbed into a government-funded exploration vehicle. Now, a lot of people say Arthur got it wrong when he did the movie 2001. I say Arthur got it right. We got it wrong. And now it's time to go back and correct that. I want to see our explorers going to Mars. I want to see them find out what's under the ice in Europa, and are there worlds around other star systems that contain life. They shouldn't be operating buildings and driving trucks as they are now. I think that we can begin to create, based on a clarity of these roles, a new partnership in space. Some of the first things we have to do, I believe, starting at the highest level and working the way down to some very immediate steps, are create an International Space Station Authority to take over management of the station. The partners should declare victory, much like the Corps of Engineers might, having built a large facility or structure, and move on to that far frontier. You know, we've just seen a situation where we had a space traffic control problem when we had 2 vehicles waiting to dock, unscheduled guests arriving, and the total meltdown of the international agreements that were set up to operate the station when it ran into its first test. I think it's time to put in a new authority to take over the station and do these jobs. I believe we need to create a system for commercial habitation modules to be allowed on the station. Let's set up a system of leases and meters where fair prices can be charged for people to have the privilege of docking to the station, and fair rates can be set on the use of supplies and resources. And then, based on that clean interface, on contractual interfaces, barters can then be made as to, well, I've got 2 extra cots, your astronauts need time on those cots. According to the contract, this is what these things are worth. Let's talk about a business trade here, as opposed to the current international barter system, which in the long run ends up stalling the opening of space. We need to look at the ability to provide the access to space for new space stations. For those people who don't want to mess with what are going to be the inevitable difficulties of negotiating contracts with an international consortium, an international operation such as the space station, we need to understand at a core philosophical level that the victory that the ability to claim victory by our government station builders in space should be based upon the success of what happens outside the airlock. In other words, having a single point entity in space called the space station is not the goal. The goal is opening the frontier to the people. And I'll tell you what, I'll believe that we've succeeded in opening that frontier when there are a half dozen space stations operating in space. And after all, we have to keep in mind that it was a privilege when Mr. Tito flew to the International Space Station. It was not a right. It was a right when he was paying his own way to go to MirCorp. But when he went to the International Space Station, we have to understand that was an unfinished government facility. Following just a few weeks before that, an accident on a submarine where civilians may or may not have been in the right place. I can understand the hesitancy there. A hotel is a very different creature and is designed completely differently. And we need to begin to make accommodation for those hotels to be built and flown in space. Then these difficulties, again, where clarity is not the case, where roles are confused, can begin to be dissipate, and we can begin to create that partnership. Finally, and most immediately, we need to use the current discussion of setting standards in space to change the debate and discussion that occurs between the private and public sectors when it comes to opening the frontier. I've been suggesting recently, and had some very good listening from people at NASA, that the private sector groups involved in this issue be called in before standards are announced. So we don't have to have the usual guerrilla fight after the standards are announced. Call us in. Get us in there, and let's all discuss what those standards should be. We have one person who's actually just been through that situation. We have astronauts, we have private sector people who are interested in creating access to ISS and other facilities. Let's get in and set standards we can all agree on. Rather than having a big fight for months afterwards, I would rather be standing there at the press conference when they're announced, along with the other leaders of space organizations who are interested in these issues, so we can all come together. The possibilities of opening space are endless. But let's not set the bar so high none can achieve it. Let's set bars that we can all reach, that people themselves can reach. And let's get the people out there. Dennis Tito may have been the first to go, but he's not the only one who wants to go. I see a future that begins with the live Miles O'Brien reports from space, Jim Cameron shooting a 3D documentary film. And then comes the next one, the action film, you know, Sly Stallone flying in space, fighting it out with some bad guys. Then the artists come, the choreographers begin to discover what you can do in zero-G with a pirouette. Then we get the extreme sports people reaching a whole new level as somebody steps out of a space station 150 miles above the Earth into the space equivalent of a surfboard and rides a wave of fire through the winds of the atmosphere back to the planet below. Soon we see then, followed by that, hotels featuring zero-G swimming pools. Imagine diving upward into a bubble of water. Imagine that. And then, somewhere, at the same time as new scientific breakthroughs that are feeding off of the reduction in costs caused by the competition and the massive activity, scientific breakthroughs begin flooding the planet. New ideas in our own relationship to the universe begins to shift. And then, on the moon, imagine this, a child who may not be able to even walk on the Earth's surface, but can walk on the moon because of the lower gravity, looks up into an inflatable giant dome, much like you see in sports arenas here on the Earth, straps on her wings and flaps her arms like kids for hundreds and hundreds of years have done, wanting to experience that dream of flight. But in this case, that child actually lifts off the ground and flies. This is what's possible. It's all possible. It's no longer about engineering. It's about deciding. And once we decide and get clear on that decision and who should do what once that decision is made, the universe is ours. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Some interesting things to think about. I know Susan and I have always been thinking about our retirement home in Buzz's old stomping grounds on the Sea of Tranquility. So we're hoping some of the things you talked about come to pass, although you did lose me when you mentioned Stallone. I think he's so yesterday.
That new Australian guy in the sword fighting movie. We'll send him.
Okay, fair enough.
There you go.
Our next speaker will be Mr. Aldrin. Buzz?
Well, I would like to thank ProSpace and your organization for assembling this rather august crew and all the people in the audience. I think what I represent is a little bit of a vision of the future formed into two different companies. One of them is Share Space Foundation, and the other is StarCraft Boosters. And I'm not going to talk about that. You can look at it, but I'm not going to talk about it. I really want to thank Rick for such rhetoric. Man, how can you follow that with the boredom of spaceflight?
Reality versus dreams, okay? It's very simple.
Anyway, Share Space got its first start, thanks a lot to Fines and Rick Tumlinson. And we've been struggling ever since. I think we have a lot of the right answers. My being here is not just because a number of people had the opportunity given them. It's because we had the guts in this country to make a commitment. And the anniversary of that commitment is coming up this Friday, and that was JFK's speech before a joint session of Congress. And I hate to see what appears to be the nation forgetting that commitment, because all you can say about the dreams being fulfilled by going to the moon, they never would have happened had it not been for a political decision that had guts to stick to it and to make that commitment in the first place. I come from an aviation family, and that's why I got involved in flying. I became a fighter pilot after a wonderful education at West Point, and I still give great thanks to that. I have a 50th anniversary. I know I don't look it, but I was telling somebody else, I was at an organization, and they were talking about part of their organization was UFO, under 40 organization. And I said, wait a minute, I belong to the OSF. That's the Office of Strategic Forces, or the over 70 fellas. Anyway, I followed a bit in my father's footsteps and had some kind of wisdom at MIT in 1961 to, believe it or not, being a fighter pilot who could intercept airplanes and shoot them down in Korea, I decided we could intercept spacecraft. This is before John Glenn flew. My thesis was underway, orbital rendezvous. My expertise is in transportation, and I've applied that to transportation to and from the moon. If I have a hero, it would be John Houbolt, who came up and despite the odds and other people saying, no, that's not the way to go, and those people include Werner von Braun and Jerry Wiesner, science advisor. John Houbolt and Lunar Orbit Rendezvous prevailed. It was a better strategy. I think I have looked at a better strategy going to the moon, and it didn't work. Cycling orbits going to the moon is not a good way to take explorers there, but it is a damn good way to go to Mars. Now, maybe that's my big objective, but that's not going to happen until we do a couple of things. And we need to reduce the cost of getting to orbit, and we need to increase the enthusiasm so the political leaders will see something to be gained by saying, let's return to the moon and go to Mars. When we started the shuttle program, the Russians, the Soviet Union, found it advisable from an international diplomatic relationship point of view to start taking other guys from other countries. Poland, Vietnam, test pilots, Cuba. What did we do? Well, we took a senator, we took a congressman, we took a Saudi prince, a test pilot from France. We did all those good things and started thinking a little broader, a little wider. Who should we take? And this illustrious author, James Michener, who wrote that wonderful fictitious mixture called space, was asked to come up with a commission to figure out who was going to fly in space. And out of that came the idea to fly a teacher in space. Well, I was watching all of this, and there's a lot of talk about journalists. Journalists will report things as they're happening. They'll talk about them. They'll write them up. They're here today and gone tomorrow because there's another piece of news. But how are stories told that last? They're told by songs. And that's why I admire John Denver, because he started an awful lot of this stuff. He was the champion of wanting other people to fly in space. And unfortunately, the government didn't quite see it his way. And then our luck ran out in the Challenger accident. So what did we do? Well, we drew back. threw money at the problem, went right back to solid rockets, which shouldn't have ever been there in the first place, but we had to compromise the shuttle from a two-stage to orbit, fully reusable, to a partially reusable, and then a booster that had the power but not the reusability. And who knows? We may be flying the shuttle for another 20 years. Man, that's wonderful. Yuri Gagarin, 40 years ago, one orbit. 20 years after that, we flew the shuttle. 20 years after that, we're still flying the shuttle. 20 years from now, we'll still be flying the shuttle. Come on now, let's have a little progress in beginning to do things that have a bit more realistic capability. At the same time we flew that tragic mission of Challenger, the National Commission on Space was just about to come out with their report. And when they did revise it slightly, nobody paid any attention to it. Still probably one of the best reports that was ever put together, pioneering the space frontier. Following in Hubolt's footsteps, I looked for a better way to contribute to that. And there was a time when NASA thought, well, gee, maybe cycling orbits might work. So we looked at them, and you know, I've been looking for some way continuously where you can go from Earth to Mars and back to Earth, back to Mars, just keep going with a continuous work. That was a good idea, and it was cited in pioneering the space frontier as the, what do we call that? Bridge between worlds. Since then, who's paid any attention to that as a strategy? No, nuclear rockets, that's the way to get there, or something else that's unobtainable, like single stage to orbit. Anyway, I submitted two ideas to the National Commission on Space. One was cycling orbits, and the other, when the group went around and talked to the public response was, we've been paying for this machine for a while. When do we get to go? And that made an impression on those people in that study, and it made an impression on me. Occasionally I heard the word, why don't you have a lottery? Man, that was a long time ago. That was over 15 years ago. And that's been perking around for quite a while, and that's the derivation of the term share space. May not be a lottery, may not be a ticket that you have a one-shot chance at, maybe something else. But flying in space is going to be expensive. Concorde's expensive. But we have to spread it around. I believe the next generation shuttle is going to be a partnership in its development between the government needs to replace a very expensive piece of machinery, access to space, and the private needs to satisfy the business of taking people into space. It's happened before. The government has sponsored things. The Homestead Act expanded the country west. Supported the railroads, got them there. Barnstormers were really killing people left and right, and the government put a little order into the airmail system. And then we got into airline travel. And ComSat was a partnership between the communications and the government. Back in the 1950s, we had a B-47 to B-52, and we were refueling it with KC-97 propellers. We were flying airlines with propellers. What did we do? The government needed a jet tanker, the KC-135. Boeing said, I'll build it, but I want to put passengers in a civil version of it, and that was a 707. That's the kind of thing that we need in the future. Space travel is so expensive, it's not going to be done by the private sector alone. Why would the government want to get involved in the X Prize? Commercial activities are going to do it. They're going to find out that it's very expensive to carry 3 people into space, and it's risky. We already carry a lot of people into space in the shuttle, and the Russians do, the Chinese will pretty soon, the governments do. Orbital flight is really where it is. We've got to open up the shuttle, and I really think we can do that. Let's see what I've written here. Wrap it up, huh?
Thanks.
In the books that I've written, it's quite evident that after John Denver, somebody like that, we do need a professional communicator in space. You can't really ask a professional astronaut to come back and tell you all these things. They don't do it. Maybe I don't know why, but that you just don't get the satisfactory answers out of us. But you will out of a professional communicator. And that's what we need in space. We need to make documentaries, and we need to open it up to more than just a couple of flights a year. And I believe we have to have things like habitation modules that are built in America, not built in Russia, and not farm out everything to the Italians. Why do we give away everything that we have in the space station? Let's do these things in the United States. I would welcome all sorts of questions.
Great. Thank you, Buzz. The last part of his statement sort of leads us into our friend Mr. O'Brien and talking about journalists in space. And Miles, before you start, I did want to tell you that I sort of brought that idea to a number of members up here on the Hill. And they were wondering if we could combine it with the fellow from Survivor, because he wants to put a show together. And apparently the idea of making journalists eat worms appeals to folks up here.
Nice to say if there was a mishap in space involving a journalist, the nation might carry on,
Exactly.
I think. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to cover the return to space of a certain septuagenarian retired senator. And in the course of that coverage, I had also the amazing opportunity to call a certain person by the name of Walter Cronkite my co-anchor. That's something to put on the resume. Who else can say that? And it was good. I had a great opportunity to ask him all kinds of important questions, like, would you like a little more cream in that, Mr. Cronkite? Spit shine this time, sir? But I did talk to him about the issue of the civilian in space program, and it was his understanding, and check me if I'm wrong on this, it was his understanding that when the civilian in space program was first instituted, the thought was a journalist would be the first person to ride on the shuttle. And in the course of Ronald Reagan's re-election campaign, in order to curry some favor with the teachers, it was came down from on high that it would be a teacher, and ultimately led to Krista McAuliffe, an interesting, ironic twist of fate. But I would submit to you that NASA had it right the first time, that a journalist would have been the right person to send along on that first trip. Of course, we all know what happened, and we all know that Challenger still casts a shadow over the space program and the decisions they make about who flies. But the floodgates have opened, courtesy of Mr. Tito here. And NASA now is in the position of trying to make a decision of whether they want to play or whether they want to watch. And I'm afraid it might be the latter, at least thus far. This comes from a somewhat frustrated reporter. Of course, that might be redundant to some of you, but frustrated reporter. There is, after all, a great story going on about 250 miles above us. And I'm not talking about the Giuliani divorce either. The space station is a great story. It's a great human story. It's an adventure. It is the ultimate frontier story. It is people coping with risk and coping with danger, persevering over engineering challenges, and by and large, doing a very fine job of succeeding thus far. But we're not getting that story. NASA, after all, is an agency populated by engineers and scientists who love their toys. They love their hardware. They love their software. They love to tell us all about it, whether it's working, whether it isn't, and how those protein crystals are going. And the bottom line is it doesn't play in Peoria. People just do not, it doesn't resonate with the general public. It's difficult for me to sell a story on protein crystals. Trust me, that is a hard sell. NASA astronauts also come from this same collective group. They are engineers, they're technicians, they have lots of advanced degrees. They aren't storytellers. There haven't been many of them. I think maybe Buzz Aldrin's crewmate, Mike Collins, was one of the best storytellers of the Apollo era, but few and far between. There certainly is in their training. If it happens by accident, quite frankly. In addition to that, there is the white scarf. And we all know, anybody who knows astronauts knows, there's really only one thing they care about, and that is their flight status. And they are loath to say anything that would put them remotely in jeopardy of losing the white scarf. And so they are perhaps more than circumspect about how they talk about their missions and how they talk about the difficulties they run into, because they do not want to rock the boat. I don't blame them. They also have a tremendous vested interest in the program, which makes it difficult for them to tell the story in any sort of objective way. In addition to all that, the agency itself is loath to talk about these issues. There are some privacy issues which they talk about. There's also the desire to gloss things over, quite frankly, to ensure that everything is nominal, as they say, or not out of family, as the term goes. Well, what happens in all of this is we end up missing the real story, and the story that everybody wants to know about. How do you put your socks on? How do you shave? What happens if you hate the other two guys on the crew? What happens if somebody's stealing your food up there? How do you stay in touch with your family? Do you miss your family? What do you miss? Do you want a pizza? These are the questions that people ask us all the time. I can't get that story right now. It doesn't come through the system. And if you think about space, I was trying to think of something that would be an analogy. It is unique. This is the only story I can think of where access to the entity itself, the main event, if you will, the date line, is completely controlled by the entity you are covering. We can go to the poles, we can go to war zones, we can circumvent Pentagon rules if we want, take our little portable equipment, teeny little DV cameras, go any place on the planet and be live and offering you objective reporting of what's going on, what your government is doing. Can't do that in space. They don't have that access. So I guess you could say the whole story is literally out of our reach. Enter Dennis Tito. And if the folks at NASA were listening, and I think they were a little bit, to this particular mission and watching it closely, this was, to date, the highest interest space station story. It wasn't the installation of the solar arrays, wasn't the delivery of the service module, it wasn't the $1 billion robotic arm. None of those things resonated like the Dennis Tito story. There's a Walter Mitty aspect to it, and that's interesting enough on its own right, but NASA made the story even more interesting by adding a David and Goliath component to it. And thus, a star is born. He sits right beside me here.
Which part did Mr. Tito play?
I think in the end he was Goliath, wasn't he? So what does that tell you? Well, I think the average person really didn't know we had a space station until Dennis Tito floated across the portals. I think many people, when they heard space station, they thought of Mir. And they really didn't know what we were up to. What was NASA's response? Well, as I alluded to, the David and Goliath aspect, they saw Dennis as a menace, if you will. And, but I'm sorry, I hate to tell you, there's no way to stop the visits. It's not a question anymore of if, it is a question of when next and who next. So, I guess the short answer to who next is whoever can pay the ticket. That would be the simple answer. But beyond that, and at the risk of being a little bit self-serving, but that's my job, I think it makes some good sense to have in the vanguard of civilians to visit space people who can tell a story, people who are objective, people who are fair but also can excite people, can educate people. The term entertainment comes to mind, although there's perhaps a bit of a pejorative, but to bring them into the tent, to create a much broader and a much deeper support for space exploration, human space exploration. I also think it probably should be members of a profession that, as part of their profession, some risk goes with the territory. They understand that. I think journalism fits all of those bills, obviously. The human drive to explore is a very fundamental thing. Most people don't think about that, but that is what we're all about. We wouldn't be sitting here right now if it weren't for that. But somehow, in the course of covering the space, the human exploration of space as we know it now, we have lost the humanity of the adventure. So I say sign me up.
Thank you, Miles. You know, while you were talking, I was looking at the little lights go on and thinking about the fact that a year ago, everybody up here was saying there would be no tax cut, and now the conversation has changed to not whether there will be or not, but how big a one. And I think Mr. Tito's done the same thing for spaceflight, not whether private citizens will or will not, but how many and how soon. Our next speaker is a gentleman from Las Vegas, Robert Bigelow of Bigelow Aerospace, who has some interesting plans he's going to share with us today. You know, one of the things that we've noticed with the new commercial space companies is that they're long on ideas, but somewhat short on capital. Senator Capps, I think they call it out in your way, all hat and no cattle, something along those lines. Well, here's a man who has both a big hat and a lot of cattle, and he's going to share with his plans with us today. Bob?
Thank you, Mark. And Mark, I want to thank you and Rick for hosting this gathering and getting us all together. I agree completely, and with all the humility that I can muster, I have to say that nothing would please us more than to see a substantial percentage of the journalistic community and as many of the political, well, let's say as a political community as possible, be strapped on to as many boosters as we could possibly get.
Democrats or Republicans?
I think it cuts across both parties. I don't think this is a partisanship thing. Mike, you shouldn't be laughing over there. I mean, we know what NASA stands for. We know that NASA stands for no access to space for Americans. Isn't that right? Huh? Isn't that right?
Not at all.
Mr. Hawes will be given time for rebuttal.
The private sector has arrived.
Our approach to this activity is strictly from we recognize the risk is more in the order of philanthropy than any kind of prudent investment decision at this point. And that's okay. That's all right. Our approach in our company is 2 years old, headquarters out of Las Vegas, and we have just filed recently for a space station license, and that's going to be an interesting process. We're very focused on that effort, and we have 2 divisions in our company. We have the Wolverine division, which is just like it sounds, a really lean, mean, well-organized group of people that can make any exotic kind of hardware for the aerospace industry or aircraft industry or through the various machines that we have. And I put out some brochures on the table there just as a kind of a heads up on what we do in that division. The Cosmos division is the fun part of our company. That's the dream side. That's the part that we lay awake at night giving us inspiration to really go forward and to do some fun things if we can. Our focus is on trying to work with inflatable systems which have been pioneered by NASA and other people long before NASA, including Goodyear Tire and Rubber, and inflatable systems have been around for 100 years or more. And I was first introduced to them a couple of years ago and invited by somebody very senior in NASA to take a very hard look at that system. And the more I looked, the more taken with it I was. It is the most ballistic-proof system that we know of, and therefore among the most safe systems that we see at this point in time. It has a lot of other attributes and features. Our company is a design, engineering, manufacturing, and assembly operation. We are very open-minded to partnering with other companies and to subcontracting with other companies. We have been a general contractor for 30 years, so we are used to doing architectural designs and engineering work on terrestrial structures, We're used to a lot of red tape. We are used to using large sums of money in a cohesive kind of effort to bring a lot of people together for a desired result. May we blow a lot of money in this effort? Yes, that's very possible. But we're taking as practical a look as we can, and we are open to partnering with other companies or countries or individuals in the effort of getting space stations, private space stations together. About 24 months from now, we expect to have 1 or 2 space-ready modules to deploy. These would be with real hardware. These would not be mock-ups. The size of each of these structures is on the order of 2.5 times or so the interior volume of anything that's on a space station today. Inflatables have the advantage of deploying themselves into a larger volume after launch, and so long as they can fit within the space, the payload flaring of the rocket, that's your primary constraint in today's technology. Our challenge isn't so much a technological challenge. We don't feel that what we're doing is particularly, even though we have filed patents on certain things and we do innovate and we think we have improved upon the NASA baseline, we feel that it's not really so much a technological challenge. Our challenge lies in other areas. I personally won't be satisfied unless we have a significant economic breakthrough. That's what I'm personally looking for, something that puts the price of habitable modules within the reach of the corporate community, not just countries, but the corporate community. And you may have very small companies who want to condominiumize a mutually shared joint ownership, as we have so many other terrestrial examples of these kinds of structures. Our other big challenge is political. We're not sure in 24 months whether or not we can even launch from this country, or we can export these products to anybody else outside this country. We may be sitting absolutely stone still with these modules in a large building somewhere with no place to go. We're all dressed up for the party, and nobody's going to take us. And we recognize that. And we've decided to go ahead and take that chance. We are affecting the launch side of the equation in that it takes far fewer launches of these modules to acquire the same cubic footage, for example, of the ISS. It will take about 1/5 as many launches to do that, perhaps 1/6 as many launches, depending upon, we've approximated that to get 40-some thousand cubic feet, the ISS about 43,000 cubic feet. Depending upon which booster we use, it will take between 7 and 9 launches, as opposed to 45 launches. So we are affecting positively the launch side of the equation. As I mentioned before, have applied for a space station license. At the present time, we are engaged in testing, calibrating a lot of the hardware that we're using. We are also involved in building a space campus for our own company's sake in Las Vegas on 50 acres that we've acquired. We've outgrown the buildings that we presently occupy. We are also starting a very serious initiative in politics and the political aspects of this whole affair, because this, by and large, is a political matter more than a technological matter. Even in some respects, I think it's slightly ahead of the economic issue, even though the economics are huge as an issue, as issues. So that's something we take very, very seriously. We are establishing corporate liaisons between our company and other domestic companies and companies overseas and other countries, people in other countries. I don't know if I were to put some kind of odds, since I'm from Las Vegas, but even though I have gaming licenses, but that has not been my background. It's mostly been in banking and real estate development. I would say that the odds are against the next space station being deployed from the United States turf. That's my opinion. I think they're against it. I'm not saying it can't happen. I just think that the grunt to make it happen is so significant that, and the willingness of other people in other countries to take note and to want to do things is quite noteworthy. And it's got our attention. In these conversations that we're having with other people in other countries, it has our attention. And maybe be stopped by the Department of State, or even maybe in the future, hopefully, the Department of Commerce from exporting our facilities, then we'll cross that bridge if it comes and try to deal with it in a political matter here in this country. But it would be a shame. We have we're trying to organize some of the groups interested in the aerospace community, some of the smaller companies and other organizations, into banding together into, and this has been talked about by a lot of people for a long time, so it's nothing new. It's just that we're trying to be proactive and trying to speak with more of a unified voice than be fractionalized so much. And we're not getting the attention that this subject needs out of Washington. So we're convening a workshop in that regard pretty soon, next month. I think that's about it.
Thank you, Bob. And as one of the participants in that upcoming workshop, I can say that you're a very brave man to bring 20 space activists to Las Vegas and put us in one room for 2 days. Should be an interesting experience. Rick and I and Pat are going to be there, and we're looking forward to it. I think it's going to be fascinating. Now we move on to our pinch hitter for the day. Senator Capps has been a state senator in the state of Oklahoma since 1971, I understand. His state has been one of the most proactive in terms of the states in taking the lead on attracting new space business, and especially new space transportation in the private manned spaceflight sector. One of the things they've done is, many of you know about the approach for tax credits for space transportation that ProSpace had been proposing for some time, and Senator Capps introduced and got passed and signed by the governor, I believe, yesterday. A state, or he didn't sign it?
He's going to sign it.
Okay. They promised me he was going to sign it yesterday, and you were going to announce it. Okay.
I was hoping he would before today.
So companies setting up, once the federal bill is introduced and hopefully passed, companies setting up in Oklahoma will get a double credit. And Senator Capps is going to share some information about that and other things that are going on in Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mark. And I appreciate you letting me fill in for Robert Triplett. I can't fill his shoes, those of you who know him, but Chairman Robert Triplett is the chairman of our Oklahoma Space Industrial Development Authority. But I can't help but say this. I'm flattered to be involved in this panel with you people here at this desk. If you're not enthused about the space industry, I think after listening to you people talk, you really become involved. Rick, you gave an outstanding talk. I can't help but be reminded of 2 statements that I've heard. One of them is you have to have vision to sell vision. And you people have vision. Another statement I heard just recently I like to use because I think you almost repeated it. Vision without action is a dream. Action without vision is a waste of time. But vision with action will change the world. And I think that's what all of us right here want to do. You talk about Oklahoma. Why do we want to be in the space industry? I haven't had anybody to deny this, but I understand we have more astronauts from Oklahoma than any other state. I hear you talk about some people, and I jotted these names down. John Denver, he has ties. That's John Dushendorf to us. That's John Denver. James Cameron married my daughter's neighbor right up the street there in Oklahoma City. But, you know, Oklahoma's been involved in the air industry for years. Senator Mike Maroney led Oklahoma in the airline industry, the airplane industry. We have Senator Nichols and Senator Inhofe, both very supportive of the space industry. And as most of you know, Senator Inhofe is a pilot. So we have a lot of support from our U.S. senators plus our House members. Now let me tell you how we became involved. Robert Triplett and I are very close, but he's been involved with maybe some of you in this room with a number of states who are interested in the space industry. So I attended a meeting with him out at Palmdale, California, back in about 98, to listen to Lockheed Martin talk about their Venture Star and their X-33, the half-scale model of Venture Star. At that meeting, they said, we are looking for maybe more than one 15,000-foot runways, and we want it to be in a sparsely populated area. But ladies and gentlemen, in my 31 years in the Senate, we have an abandoned Air Force base at Clinton Sherman, which is in western Oklahoma, that was listed at one time as an alternate landing for the spacecraft. 15,000-foot runway. Yes, we don't like to be sparsely populated, but this time it was helpful. And so we made out our application, and we got to listing all our good things, and we found out we had something that the space industry liked. We have another good blessing. I'm going to drop some names, but Dr. Chris Shove was in Florida back in the early 80s, working with the Department of Commerce in Florida, working for Jeb Bush under Department of Commerce. He drafted the language that created the Florida Space Authority. After that, he moved to Oklahoma and was a professor at OU. So he helped us draft our language that we have, which created our Oklahoma Space Authority. In that bill, we gave all type of tax incentive for the space industry. We designated a spaceport area at the Clinton Sherman site. We have what we call a spaceport territory, which is sort of a buffer zone around it, which is 14 miles by 12 miles square, which figures out about 168 square miles. But we drafted that hoping to attract someone like Lockheed Martin. Now, all of us know the problem they've had with the X-33. I'm one of the believers they'll get it corrected, but I may be wrong. But as we drafted that language for them. And then some of the smaller companies have come to us and said, we're not big companies. We don't need a tax credit for ourselves. We would like to pass that tax credit on to our investors. So they brought me the sample of the federal bill, Mark, that was drafted here. I think we improved upon it. I really do. But we took that, and what we do in that bill, and this is Senate Bill 55, it passed the Senate 41-1 last week, and then later in the week it passed the House 99-1. And yes, I sure feel the governor will sign it. But in that bill, if a person invests in this type of space ventures, well, you'll get over 50% tax write-off on your income tax or on insurance premium. And we think this will be a big benefit to people who are wanting to invest in this type of industry. We feel that within a year or two, people will learn about the space industry, and I think they'll invest in it very readily. Some people compare this similar to the computer business when it first started. They were afraid to invest. But we feel like after they once start, well, then it will develop very rapidly. But that's our goal in Oklahoma, is to attract people. We feel like with the single-stage vehicles, which we think will come on board, you won't need to drop a tank off into the ocean. And we're up and running. And I only need to say this. I look out, and I've met a number of you from other states. You know, other states are not our competitors. Do you know that? The foreign countries are our competitors on the space industry. I want Dennis Tito to be able to go back into space from the United States and send other people into space from the United States without having to go to Russia or China or Japan. So I think that's what we need to all work as together is whatever we can do on our state level and a federal level to keep this industry in the United States.
Thank you, Senator. And for those of you on the staff side who are interested in the federal version of the tax credits bill, that's being introduced and worked on by Ken Calvert of California, Brian Wagner from his staff is out there. Say hi, wave. Say hi, Brian. And Mr. Calvert is just giving it its last pass and hopes to get it introduced in the not-too-distant future. The idea is to create tax credits for investors in new space transportation, because the people that have the great ideas about new space transportation are generally new companies. They don't have revenues, much less profits, to write off R&D tax credits, so they need a way to attract investment. And so Mr. Calvert and the folks from Oklahoma, I think, have the right approach. Well, that brings us to the end of our formal presentations, and I want to start the general discussion by turning to our two experts on the market. That would be Eric Anderson and Tom Rogers, and ask both of you if you could tell us where the market stands for private human spaceflight right now. And Eric, I know that you actually have money in the bank on this, so maybe you'd like to kick that off.
Sure, thanks, Mark. I think that most of us would now agree with the statement that a lot of people have been making for a long time in the entrepreneurial space world, which is that there is a huge potential existing market for space tourism. Travel and tourism in general is an industry that's much larger than the aerospace industry. You know, it's measured in trillions in terms of overall airline ticket transportation and tours and all these sorts of things. Even high-end luxury and adventure travel is a multi-tens of billions of dollar business. And I kind of think when you're looking at the scenarios out there for opening up space, for creating the future that we've all dreamed of as space enthusiasts, space stations and space research facilities and hotels on the moon and all these exciting ideas. And you look at what commercial activities currently exist. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but I would bet that there's less than 100 launches of any type per year, or of any commercial type, certainly, far less probably, for things like remote sensing and even communication satellites, which we all have experience with and use every day, to get television reception and things like that. But the actual volume of space transportation units every year is very, very low. And there's no economy of scale to it, or very little. Each rocket built is a unique vehicle. They're all slightly different. They all require lots and lots of people and dollars to build and support them. And tourism as an industry has the potential today to have not tens of units going on and being sold and being produced and operated and things like that, but thousands and tens of thousands. There are a lot of people in this world, a lot of companies who not only have the means, but who are interested in flying in space, who are passionate about flying in space. And I can't help but think, when I listen to Mr. Tito describe how great the experience was and how it went beyond his expectation, and I look at all of our market research and all of the numbers we have for people who want to go now without ever having experienced anything like it, I wonder how quickly it will propagate once we have people who are bringing this back and really describing this experience and talking about it. History and progress doesn't move linearly. It always moves in quantum, patterns where you have a short period of time where a lot of progress happens. And I can't help but believe that we're here now at a point in time where that's imminent. And whether it's done entirely commercially or with the support of the government in various aspects in various countries, I think it's going to happen because, people want it to happen, and there's money and resources and capital there. And I realize I've spoken about this in a general sense. I know that from the experience of our small company, we've had an unbelievable amount of interest in all types of space and space-related adventure and adventure experience programs. So much so that to describe the statistic that Mark mentioned when he introduced me, that even 2 or 3 years ago, when our company first began proposing and talking about the idea of sending adventure tourists on suborbital space flights, 30-minute or 45-minute jaunts excuse me, into space, the interest was so overwhelming that people actually said, you must come up with a way of letting us give you money to reserve places. Companies, major Fortune 500 companies did the same thing, not just individuals, but so that we can be one of the first to participate in these new programs. And that was when it was nothing, as I've said before, but my business partners and I running around with PowerPoint presentations showing people what we were talking about, thinking about. And now that we're actually here and that there are actually many credible plans for vehicles being developed, for new space stations and space systems, and people who've been there beginning to really support this, I can only say, the floodgates have opened. And I don't know if it's, I don't know exactly how long it will be or would dare to give a projection, but I really feel that we've rounded the corner and the market is there. I think that the public support for Mr. Tito's flight and for things like it is so large that we need to get ready, and that the market will definitely drive this whole thing. And as an added note, I'll just say that space tourism in a greater sense really is one of the only markets in space that can support this sort of dollar volume and activity now. No matter how many cell phones we have, we're only going to need a certain number of satellites in orbit, and only things like concepts like space solar power require the infrastructure that we must develop through space tourism. And it really is a catalyst for a lot of other things. So it goes beyond just the businesses and the ideas and the people that are promoting things now. It really is a catalyst for a future in space that we've all dreamed of and can see coming.
Eric, I want to jump in, and I want to bring Tom into this, because I think, Tom, you've just redone the quantifying study that you did for NASA, about 5 years ago. And I was wondering if you could tell us, I know you want to present this at your own space tourism conference in June, but if you could tell us a little bit about what those numbers are telling us about the actual market potential.
I'd like to do two things.
Can you pull your mic down, Tom?
Two things. One, let me speak to the market, and then let me go back and try to lend additional emphasis on the absolute zero-order importance of your trip, Mr. Tito. Zero order. When the NASA STA study took place, we were quite pleased to see the way that it went. It was a cooperative study. And very, very pleased when, in its final hours, I got a call from Leonard David. And Leonard said that he had just heard of a study completed by Yankelovich Partners, a well-known national polling organization, for a travel firm in Florida. What the study showed, we were able to get into an appendix in the NASA STA cooperative report. Essentially what it said is that if you ask the American traveling public in the way that a Yankelovich would, and the traveling public they defined as those 130 million of us that take at least 1 or 2 trips a year, at least 50 miles away, and stay overnight. Would you like to take a trip on the shuttle or equivalent? Of the 130 million people, 1/3, some 40 million people said yes. What would you be willing to pay? And they answered. The total amounts were enormous. 7.5% of the people said they would spend $100,000 or more. Now that's 7.5% of 130 million people divided by 3. If you annualize that is a multi-billion-dollar-a-year business. And that is one of the most important reasons why we should be pursuing the satellite, the general public in space. Economic growth, the great possibilities of large space-related economic growth. And that allows and prompts me to say something else. I grew up in the space world in the information areas. Communications, navigation, position fixing, remote sensing. 7 years after the launch of Sputnik, the first commercial revenues were being generated in the satellite communications business by the ComSat Corporation. It is now 40 years after Gagarin's trip. There is no money being spent involving people in space without the friendly federal government being the customer. 45 years after the Wright brothers, we had some 40 airlines carrying 10 million people a year and 250 million pounds a year. We have no airlines today. The government brings people up. They all work for the government. Were they really that much smarter then than we are now? Were they really that much smarter than? No. There's one other thing to say about those numbers. Another study has been conducted by a very well-known polling marketing company. They're going to release the results of the study at Bob Haldeman's Travel and Tourism meeting toward the end of June. All I can say is, at this moment, you will not be disappointed at what you hear them say. So economic growth is one reason for opening up space. Another is, if you have large enough markets, the efficiencies of what you carry on allows you to drop the costs. If we fly 5 shuttles to the space station and back at $500 million apiece, that's what the average shuttle flight will be, will cost. If we flew 10 and charged the marginal cost for the next 5 of $100 million apiece, we will have averaged the cost of a trip to space in a shuttle 40% less than today. No R&D. We need big markets, markets of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and they are certainly not beyond reason. The third thing is that when you bring that many people of such diverse backgrounds, what you bring are ideas, new ways of thinking about what to do there, new ways about how to do things. And we need that. We need that. What's going on for the last 40 years has put us in a position now to open that opportunity to the United States.
Thank you, Tom.
Now, I have one more thing to say.
I'm sorry.
1966, I was having a drink with a man by the name of Herman Kahn. I don't know how many of you know Herman Kahn. Herman wrote a book entitled On Thermonuclear War. At the time, I was in the office of the Secretary of Defense, and we just put the space segment of the world's first global satellite communication system up, and Herman and I were good professional acquaintances. We were talking about it. By the end of our discussion, we had agreed on the following 2 things. 1, we would not live to see the end of the Cold War. 2, when the end of the Cold War came, you could bet your bottom dollar that the United States of America would see its people take advantage of all this technology and all this experience and get to space. Wrong, wrong. I'm still sort of alive, but we haven't gotten to space. And I'll skip over the next 10 years, except to say one thing that will be very difficult for you all to imagine today. But about 15 years ago, I started to speak in public in this city of all wisdom and decision about the possibility of space tourism. My wife, who never really felt moved to come and listen to me talk, did this once. And I went down to the back of the room afterwards to talk with her, and she was crying. What the hell, I asked, what's the matter? She said, I can't stand people laughing at you. That's where we were. Look, the United States, the world's greatest democracy, is made up of an egalitarian society whose members insist upon being personally and directly involved in any activity of sufficient importance to them. We're talking about the United States of America now. Therefore, the distinguishing feature of the United States Civil Space Program is not science, and I'm a physicist, or used to be, not exploration, not technology development, all of which we and other countries can and should pursue. Rather, we are committed to seeing space opened up to the general public. Mr. Tito, some of us have waited a long time for you to do what you did. Thank you very much. And we will see changes now in the civil space area that are zero order. We've waited too long for them, but the United States is pretty good at catching up. I observe that the United States moves out smartly when one or the other of two things happens. One, it gets scared to death, or two, it sees a chance to get sick rich. Eric? Let's go to it. Thank you very much, Mark.
Well, with all this talk of our civil space program, it makes me want to turn to Mr. Hawes and see if he has any observations about what he's heard here today.
I'm not quite sure if I'm David or Goliath or just a jackal.
Well, we'll give you your honorary jackal card at the end of this.
I reminded Rick I've been on panels like this with him before, and it's always the same kind of feeling, being the dinosaur here in the crowd. This has been an interesting few months, and I think I agree with many of the sentiments that you heard today. We have not seen the last tourist. We certainly haven't seen the last non-professional astronaut that's going to fly, and even we recognize that and understand that. We have been actively trying to deal with what message that gives us and how do we position not just NASA but the space station, if you will, for that likelihood. We think there's a number of different categories of non-professional astronauts that we will see fly. How they get there, who they're sponsored by, what their missions are, how they pay their way, how they're sponsored, those are all things that will be determined, and probably each instance will be something that's very different. So we have actively been trying to put together a form of criteria, a process for determining how we can safely fly folks of any of those particular cases. We do believe that we have a good shot at getting the criteria done this summer for non-professional astronauts, and just talking with Charlie Precourt, the head of the astronaut, a couple days ago, we think we're still in good shape to do that this summer. So the dinosaur is moving, but there's a lot of things that I think are still of interest in having this roundtable up here in Congress. I think speaks to part of the problem, and that's that there is still yet a number of policy debates that have to happen in this whole enterprise. There are a lot of folks who believe they're building a multi-billion-dollar research lab, not a hotel, just as there are many folks who believe it can be both. And I think that that debate has to take place, and this is the type of group that forces that debate to take place. And it needs to take place all across the government, not in any one particular body. Our capabilities are, and that NASA get where it needs to be in the debate and where it needs to be in the process of ensuring that we can manage this space station, whether we're just dealing with the business travelers or those that have other purposes. I think we will get there.
Thanks, Mike. And you know, one of the things that you say is very true. It's one of the reasons why ProSpace was founded, because NASA makes requests for things, but it's the folks in these buildings and the folks up Pennsylvania Avenue and the White House that make the decisions as to what we're going to do. And I think, quite frankly, I've always felt that folks take off a little too much on NASA just because you guys are executing a policy that you've been asked to execute. I don't agree with a lot of the policies, but but I also know that the folks here are the ones that are giving you permission to go, and that's one of the reasons why we hold these events.
And I would allude, one thing that Rick did mention is that part of the challenge of the space station, of course, is that same policy debate has to happen in a lot of countries with the same kind of positive effect and answer, but we see a lot of interest across all of those countries, so I think that there is still hope.
Well, the next roundtable will actually be on the International Space Station Authority, talking about how it is we have that debate, so we'll invite you back for that one. I want to turn to Pat Dash for a minute. She's about to head down to Phoenix and visit with how many of your members?
It's Albuquerque, and
oh, pardon
there's
me.
going to be about 1,000 of them there.
I keep getting you and Henry Vanderbilt mixed up, which is scary.
Pretty scary for me.
For those of you who know both of them. All right, now, have you noticed a change in your membership at all since in the last year or since Mr. Tito's flight became evident?
I've heard an awed silence for the most part. One of the most interesting things I've noticed is I and my colleague Frank Sitzen, I think between us conducted over 100 interviews in the lead up to your flight, Mr. Tito, and the few days afterwards. And again, the question from journalists was, but this guy's got mega bucks. I mean, this isn't real. How can the public identify with this? I haven't heard from a single one of our 20,000 members, and I would say 60% of them are members purely and simply because they want to go. I haven't heard from anyone who has been envious or who has said, he's different, because each of them would spend right up to their last buck, however much that might be, to go if they could. That's how committed our membership are. In terms of different reactions, the questions I get are, what can we do? The door is opened. How do we jump on this train? How do we keep it moving? And we have a lot of members. We have a lot of vision. I hear a lot of different things. From the practical side of the house, I hear work with people like Mike Hawes. Make sure those criterion get put in place this summer. We want those in place. None of us want to see NASA embarrassed the way it was, quite honestly. We need to move beyond that. We need to open up the international debate. What does the partnership really want to use the space station for? And when it's fully up and running, is there a role for space tourism? Those debates need to happen. I hear the NGO report is due at the end of the year. Let's start thinking about pulling NASA out of the operations business as construction is completed. Let's think about how commercial activity on space station is going to be coordinated during the government-industry partnership period. People talk about handing off to industry and commercial use completely after construction. That's another debate that has to happen. And then I have the people out there on the horizon who say, can't we sign up to Buzz's lottery today? We want a chance. We want a hope of going into space. Where do I buy a ticket? And that brings us back full circle to people like Buzz have been trying for several years to open up seats on the shuttle. People at JSC tell me this week, it ain't going to happen. So we need the funding profiles, we need the commercial vehicles to take people to space. Then we can make the dreams a reality. We can make the lottery meaningful. We need seats to space. There are lots of people ready to go.
Thank you. That brings us to the last gentleman I want to turn to, who I hope brought a note from his mother, Mr. Ladwig. Thanks for dropping by. Although I was sitting here wondering if we had actually had a conversation about what room this thing was in, so I saw you wander. I had this image of you wandering the halls. In any case, Mr. Tito brought up in his talk the returning to the Citizens of Space program, and I know that that's something you worked very hard on while you were at NASA in the mid-'80s. And I was wondering if you could tell us what was planned and what did we lose there and how can we get it back?
Well, I'm sorry for being late, but I just got back from I was delayed coming back from out of town where I attended a session all weekend that dealt with finding your passion, fulfilling your dreams. So it's rather appropriate that I come back to this panel because that's really what this panel is all about. It's fulfilling a dream that many people have. And this course also dealt in the realm of all possibilities. You can always find a reason not to do something, but if you can also always find a way to do something if you get committed to it. So I think that's where we need to start shifting the focus and getting this policy debate going that Mike mentioned. During this, the spaceflight participant program that began in 1984, and the first opportunity was given to a teacher in space. And originally, when a committee looked at was it the right time to put somebody on the shuttle, that task group got started in 1982 when the shuttle had only flown a couple of times. The committee came back and said, yes, it's appropriate to start flying people in space if there's a purpose that goes with it. And the purpose that was felt was valid was to communicate what that experience is all about. It was felt that the view and the lens we were getting from the astronaut corps was rather restricted, rather unemotional, and that's nothing negative against the individuals. It's just the way they are and the way they communicate. So it was determined then that the first opportunity, much to the chagrin of the journalists, would be a teacher in space. And that program initiated some 40,000 requests for the entry packet. Some 11,500 people actually applied. There were 2 winners per state and some overseas territories and things. And then we narrowed that down to 10. And from that, Krista McAuliffe was selected and Barbara Morgan was selected as the backup. Now, had it all gone as planned, there would have been perhaps 2 to 3 opportunities like that going on per year. And as it was, the first participant would be on the 25th shuttle flight, even though this whole study had started, I think, when we had only finished the 4th shuttle flight. So it was felt as though enough time had passed. While the accident occurred, I had been coming back to town to participate in the next phase of the journalist in space. That was the next category. We had gotten down to 40 national finalists. And then beyond that, we were looking at the potential category of an artist in space. We had a great challenge there trying to figure out, well, how do you determine who's an artist and what external organization might we work with to help develop those criteria. But I must say I was really looking forward to having an opportunity to try to figure that one out. And there would have been other categories all along. At the same time the categories were announced, our office was getting besieged with letters from everybody else. You know, well, why is this being restricted to a teacher? Or why do you have to be a communicator? Why can't it be a kid? The 2 biggest categories we heard from were kids and senior citizens. It was amazing. And the senior citizens would send their clippings of how they were jogging and climbing mountains and jumping out of airplanes. And the kids would send me their transcripts or tell me why they were so smart and why they should be the first. And it was tremendously uplifting. I always felt during that time I had one of the best jobs at NASA because I was there to try to help people find their dream. Unfortunately, I was seen as the bureaucrat that was getting in between them and their dream because we had all these other categories. So what we lost when the accident happened was this opportunity to really open that door, to start letting a wider range of the public get this opportunity to fly. When I left the agency for the first time in 1989, I decided I wanted to go out and write about this dream because I had been getting all these letters from everybody, and I saw how they lit up when they got to talk about why they would want to go. And it wasn't as though it was a new dream. When I was doing my research, I came across all kinds of letters that people sent to Robert Goddard in the 1920s, begging to fly in his rocket to the moon. He was more irritated by that attention than pleased, but people were recommending that they'd go husband and wife teams, they wanted to be the first kid, they wanted to be the first military person. They wanted to go so that they could come back and run for Congress. There were people that wanted Goddard to send their senators into space and not bring them back. Then the Hayden Planetarium in the 50s, based on setting up an interplanetary tour booth outside of a lecture on the future of space that Wernher von Braun was in, that form they developed for that evening, and there were about 800 people in the audience, got replicated all over the world over the next 6 or 7 years. And eventually they had some 30,000 letters that they got from people wanting to fill out those forms. Travel companies wanted to be the agents for it. Hayden started sending everybody little cards that gave them their reservation number and information about space. And when I was the head of the Spaceflight Participant Program, people sent me copies of those Hayden cards and said, okay, we're ready to cash this in. Where do we go? And the same thing happened with the 93,000 people that during the 60s signed up for the Pan Am flights, the first Moon Flight Club.
Still have my card.
93,000 people. And it got the biggest boost, of course, after the movie 2001 when you saw the Pan Am shuttle. And people sent me copies of those cards and said, when can I turn this in? And then we had the thousands. I think we probably had some 40,000 letters that we got once the spaceflight participant opportunity was announced, and people wanting to go. And it was something that in their letters you could see they had passion. This was something they cared about in the space program. And I always felt that what we missed with the Challenger accident was that this gave everybody a reason to say, you see, it was too early. It wasn't safe. Because that's what every time you try to open up the categories of who got to fly in space, the other thing I found while I was researching the book, was the incumbent flyers resisted the next step. So the test pilot astronauts didn't like it that science astronauts were going to get to go. And then when they started letting women and minorities come in, that was a difficult transition. Then the corporate payload specialist and those other specialists that flew because their country or company flew a satellite on the space shuttle, they were resisted. The teacher was resisted. The journalist was going to be resisted, mainly because we were sure the journalists weren't going to play by the rules at all. So every time there was this fight to open it up, and we saw the same thing happen with Dennis Tito. That here the category was going to open up again, and damn them, no, it was not going to open up because the engineers in charge said it's too early or it's unsafe. And I could have almost bought that argument. And actually the first interview I did on this, I kind of tried to go the NASA way on it. I said, well, you know, if Dennis was a real team player here, maybe he would wait till October. Well, why should he? It was a commercial activity. It was his money. He was ready to go. So I was disappointed that then NASA didn't use this attention that the world had on the space station instead of bitching about, well, he's making it very difficult for us up there, and you know, it's going to be very dangerous, it's going to cost us all this money. Why the hell didn't we use that as an opportunity to focus on what the space station is going to do? Instead of the main news at the time was the $4 billion overrun. How about using that opportunity to say, well, yeah, there's this overrun, but here's all the great things that are going to come out of the space station, and enlist him as a spokesperson to help us do that, instead of treating him like the enemy. So that was a big disappointment, needless to say.
Giving up your plans to return to the agency?
Yeah. Which is the most liberating thing about following your passion and dreams, and it's so nice to be on a panel with Rick where I don't have to defend the agency against him and do our wrestling match.
You're making me look calm right now. I love it. Go ahead.
So the negative signs that I see to try to move this along, and how, again, I think we've lost the momentum that could have been started with the Spaceflight Participant Program, was the reaction to Dennis. Instead of embracing it, it was like, you know, go away. I think the Chutzpah Award has to go to Senator John Glenn, who, of all the nerve to say something about Dennis Tito's flight after the way he got to go on, because, you know, he is a senator, so I guess he gets to go. And then to see the reaction of other congressmen and senators to the Tito flight, and some of the, I mean, it almost got personal at a certain point. You're a bigger man than I am for sitting there taking it. The positive signs that I see, of course, are the Space Launch Initiative, and I really don't want to get into debate with anybody about the merits of the Space Launch Initiative. Let's just try to take the high road for the moment and say at least it's a step in the right direction, because maybe that'll help the technology, because without the technology, and as Pat said, without the spacecraft, nobody is going to go anywhere. I think the X Prize is still a positive sign. I don't know how many of those original 21 companies are still in business or who have fallen by the wayside, but some of them are still hanging in there. And I think the fact that Mike said they are working on criteria with the international partners to find out what would be safe to be on board is a very encouraging sign, and I salute the agency for that. So what we started with the Spaceflight Participant Program was opening that dream up. The accident put it back on hold for much too long as far as I'm concerned. I do think the upside of Senator Glenn flying was that we were able to get Barbara Morgan in as a regular astronaut. I think that probably would have been delayed for a long time had some of us not argued on her behalf and said, well, if he gets to go, then she gets to go. And it is high time for the agency to start thinking again about, is it the right time to reintroduce an SSIP program? They're not easy to do. You'll always get this thing about why this category, why not that category. It's not inexpensive to do a national selection process, but there might be a good opportunity to do something with a commercial company and let the commercial company figure out how to do that. So I would encourage us to help people meet their passion, help them meet their dreams, and you can always find a reason not to do this, and I think it's high time we start looking for how to do it.
Good for you.
Well, seems we saved the passionate for last. I would love to continue this. Unfortunately, I know some of the members of our panel have other appointments, and there's another group coming in here in about 15 minutes. So I just want to thank everybody up here today. This has been a fascinating discussion. And I think I mentioned earlier, our next meeting will be on the International Space Station Authority. That will be in July. Keep an eye on this channel for further news.
Bob and Tim, I have any feeling.
And on that basis, the roundtable is adjourned. Thank you, folks.
Thank you. All right.
Being with you, Mike.
Oh, I know.
Well done.
It